Northern shores of Vestfold, Norway, 847 CE. The thunderous crack of longship hulls, splintering against hidden rocks, shattered the midnight stillness of Ravnfjord, echoing off the mist-shrouded cliffs that loomed over Hakon Ragnarsson's isolated homestead. Through the howling gale, a harsh command carried on the bitter wind. Burn their ships, leave no survivors. The Danes must never reach Ravnholm. If you're watching this tale of Viking courage, tell us in the comments where you're hearing our sagas from. And if this story of a blind warrior's redemption strikes your heart like Thor's hammer, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've prepared an epic about the shield maiden who defied a king. What the villagers of Ravnholm couldn't possibly understand, what would soon become their salvation in their darkest hour, was that the solitary figure listening from the cliff's edge was far more than just another disgraced warrior living in exile. For 7 years, Hakon the Forsaken had been cast aside, mocked as a burden, a once mighty warrior rendered useless by the battle that claimed his sight but spared his life. The elders thought they'd banished a broken man, a drain on precious winter resources. They were about to discover they'd exiled the one person who could save them all from annihilation. Hakon's scarred hands gripped his walking staff as he tracked the unfolding ambush through sound alone. The Danish raiders had been lured to their doom, their dragons' heads splintering against the submerged stone formations that guarded the hidden approach to Ravnholm's harbour. Most ships never reached the shore. The few Danish warriors who struggled through the freezing waters were swiftly dispatched by waiting Ravnholm defenders. But something felt wrong in the pattern of combat, the rhythm of steel against steel carrying hidden meanings that only Hakon could perceive. At 48 winters, Hakon had lived longer than most warriors of his era. His once fiery red beard had turned snow-white, framing a face marked by a savage diagonal scar that cut across where his eyes had been. Yet he moved with surprising grace along the cliff path, his other senses having sharpened to extraordinary levels in the 7 years since the Battle of Njardarhofen had claimed his sight. The raid unfolding below wasn't what it appeared to be. Hakon could tell from the positioning of combatants, from the deliberate pattern of the Danish ship's approach. This wasn't a simple raid. It was reconnaissance disguised as attack. The main Danish force remained hidden, gathering intelligence about Ravnholm's defences. Through the clash of weapons and dying men's cries, Hakon detected another sound, oars slicing water far to the east, where no Ravnholm defender would think to look. A cold realization settled in his gut like a stone. The village had survived this night, but they had revealed their defensive strategy to an enemy that wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The familiar rhythm of footsteps approaching pulled Hakon from his calculations. "Shouldn't you be hiding in your hut, old man?" The voice belonged to Thorstein, once Hakon's second in command, now captain of Ravnholm's warriors. "These cliffs are no place for a blind man on a night of battle. They let themselves be destroyed too easily," Hakon replied, ignoring the barb. "The Danish captains I knew would never sacrifice 8 ships without purpose." Thorstein snorted. "The rocks claimed them, as they've claimed many fools who don't know these waters. Nothing more to it. The timing of their approach, the spacing of their ships," Hakon began. "Save your battle strategies for the ale hall, where old warriors relive past glories," Thorstein cut him off. "Ravnholm has no use for the tactical wisdom of a blind man." The wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable scent of pine tar and wet wool from the eastern waters, smells no Ravnholm ship would carry in this season. Hakon turned his face toward it, but said nothing. 7 years of exile had taught him the futility of offering unwanted counsel. "The village celebrates tonight," Thorstein continued, his voice softened slightly by what might have been pity. "Jarl Sigurd has declared a feast for our victory." "A feast for a battle not yet truly fought," Hakon murmured. But Thorstein was already walking away, his footsteps fading into the night. Alone again on the cliff edge, Hakon traced his fingers over the intricate carvings on his walking staff. A wolf's head his son Leif had crafted before they'd parted ways, the boy following his mother to the southern settlements rather than share his father's disgrace. The memory stung worse than the salt wind on his scarred face. Hakon made his way carefully back to his isolated hut, built on the very edge of Ravnholm territory, as far from the central hall as one could live without being completely banished. The village had once revered him as their greatest shield-bearer, the tactical mind behind 3 decades of successful raids and defenses. Now he was barely tolerated, allowed to exist on the margins as a concession to his former glory. What the people of Ravnholm had never understood, what they had never bothered to discover in the years since his blinding, was that Hakon had developed gifts far beyond ordinary perception. His hearing had become so acute he could identify individual warriors by their breathing patterns alone. His sense of smell could detect subtle changes in wind and weather hours before they arrived. His fingers could read terrain through his staff like others read runes. Most importantly, his mind had remained as sharp as ever, analyzing patterns others missed, perceiving strategies in the rhythm of combat that sighted warriors overlooked. But no one had bothered to ask, and pride had prevented him from offering what he assumed would be rejected. The sounds of celebration echoed across the fjord as Hakon kindled a small fire in his hearth. The village would drink and boast until dawn, believing themselves safe from Danish aggression. They didn't understand the patient, calculating mind of Gorm the Shrewd, the Danish Jarl whose tactics Hakon had studied and countered for nearly 2 decades before losing his sight. This night's victory carried all the hallmarks of Gorm's strategic thinking, sacrificing a small force to gauge an enemy's strength, using apparent defeat to mask his true intentions. While Ravnholm celebrated, Gorm would be analyzing everything learned from this encounter, preparing for the real attack. As Hakon prepared his simple evening meal, memories surfaced of another feast long ago, when he had sat at Jarl Sigurd's right hand, honored above all warriors. Before the disastrous expedition to Njardarhöfen, before the burning arrows had rained down on their ships, before he had awakened days later with bandaged eyes and the healer's grim pronouncement that he would never see again. The meal sat bitter in his throat as he recalled what followed, the gradual withdrawal of respect, the increasing marginalization as he struggled to relearn basic tasks, the final humiliation when the Council of Elders had declared him an unnecessary burden during the harsh winter months. Only his decades of service had prevented complete banishment. Instead, he was relegated to this solitary existence, permitted to fish and trap to support himself, but no longer welcome in the warrior's circle. His isolation had become both wound and weapon. Cut off from the community, he had been forced to adapt, to forge new ways of understanding his surroundings. He had spent years developing a mental map of the entire coastline, learning to navigate by sound, smell, and the feel of the wind on his skin. His hearing had grown so acute he could track wolves through the forest by their breathing, identify approaching weather from subtle changes in how waves struck the shore. A sudden shift in the night sounds pulled Hakon from his thoughts. The celebration in the village had taken on a different tone, louder, more chaotic. Then came the alarm horn, 3 long blasts signaling immediate danger. Hakon was on his feet instantly, staff in hand, head tilted to better capture the sounds carrying across the water. The pattern of shouting, the clash of weapons hastily retrieved, the disorganized nature of the defense, all told him what his eyes could not see. The real attack had begun, while Ravnholm's warriors were deep in their cups, celebrating their illusory victory. "Gorm," Hakon muttered, recognizing the tactical brilliance. The earlier raid had been perfectly calculated, significant enough to prompt celebration, but not so threatening as to keep Ravnholm's defenders sober and vigilant. Without hesitation, Hakon moved along the cliff path toward the village, his staff finding the way with practiced precision. Though 7 years had passed since he'd walked this route as a respected warrior, his feet remembered every turn, every tree root, every change in elevation. He moved with surprising speed for a blind man, driven by urgency and the certainty that Ravnfjord faced annihilation. The sounds of battle grew louder as he approached. Steel against steel, the crackle of burning thatch, screams of the wounded and dying. But more telling to Hakon's trained ear was the disciplined, methodical nature of the Danish attack. This was no ordinary raid seeking plunder. This was conquest, methodically executed. "Hold the line, form a shield wall," Thorstein's voice carried, above the chaos, strained with desperation rather than confidence. The responding warriors sounded scattered, disorganized, many likely still clouded by celebratory mead. Hakon paused at the village boundary, assessing the battle through sound alone. The Danish force had split into 3 distinct units. One, engaging Ravnfjord's hastily assembled defenders near the Great Hall. Another, systematically burning outlying buildings, and a third circling behind to cut off escape routes to the forest. Classic Gorm tactics, executed with precision. A familiar voice cut through the din. Jarl Sigurd himself, bellowing orders that grew increasingly desperate as his forces failed to coalesce into effective resistance. The man who had sanctioned Hakon's exclusion was now paying the price for discarding his most experienced tactician. Fall back to the hall. Protect the women and children. The command indicated how quickly the situation had deteriorated. Ravnfjord's warriors were being pushed inward, their defensive perimeter collapsing. Hakon stood motionless, conflict raging within him. These people had cast him aside, treated his blindness as worthlessness, relegated him to the margins of their society. By the harsh code of their culture, he owed them nothing. Yet these were still his people, the community he had defended for decades before darkness claimed his sight. More importantly, he understood what the others did not. This wasn't just another raid to be weathered. Gorm the Shrewd never committed. His forces without absolute certainty of victory. Without intervention, Ravnfjord would fall before dawn, its people enslaved or slaughtered. The decision crystallized as Hakon detected a sound that sent ice through his veins, the high-pitched whistling of fire arrows being nocked. Gorm's archers were preparing to ignite the great hall itself, where Ravnfjord's women and children were now gathered. 7 years, Hakon muttered. 7 years they've looked through me like I'm already in my grave. He adjusted his grip on his staff, feeling the wolf's head carving beneath his fingers. But a blind wolf still has teeth. With surprising speed, Hakon moved toward the sounds of battle, avoiding the main conflict. His years of isolation had not been spent in self-pity, but in relentless adaptation. Though blind, he had continued to train daily, refining fighting, techniques that relied on hearing and touch rather than sight. His staff, seemingly a blind man's aid, was in truth a carefully balanced weapon, its weight and balance perfectly suited to his modified fighting style. As he approached the Danish archers preparing to fire upon the great hall, Hakon began to whistle a low, eerie tune, the same melody he had used to signal flanking maneuvers in countless battles before his blinding. The sound carried across the night air, distinctive amid the chaos of battle. The effect was immediate. Several veteran Ravnfjord warriors, recognizing their former commander's signal, instinctively responded, breaking from their defensive positions to follow the sound. Muscle memory from years of training under Hakon's command kicked in, overriding their surprise at his intervention. "The blind one comes to die with us," someone shouted, but there was no mockery in the voice, only grim acknowledgement. Hakon's response was cold as winter. "I come to ensure the Danes die first. Beneath the howling gale and crash of combat, Hakon detected the subtle shifting of feet on wet grass, the whisper of bowstrings being drawn, the controlled breathing of archers preparing to release their deadly volley. These were sounds invisible to sighted warriors focused on the enemies before them, but to Hakon they painted a clear picture of the imminent threat. "Gorm," Hakon muttered, recognizing the tactical brilliance. The earlier raid had been perfectly calculated, significant enough to prompt celebration, but not so threatening as to keep Ravnholm's defenders sober and vigilant. Without hesitation, Hakon moved along the cliff path toward the village, his staff finding the way with practiced precision. Though 7 years had passed since he'd walked this route as a respected warrior, his feet remembered every turn, every tree root, every change in elevation. He moved with surprising speed for a blind man, driven by urgency and the certainty that Ravnholm faced annihilation. The sounds of battle grew louder as he approached, steel against steel, the crackle of burning thatch, screams of the wounded and dying. But more telling to Hakon's trained ear was the disciplined, methodical nature of the Danish attack. This was no ordinary raid seeking plunder. This was conquest, methodically executed. "Hold the line! Form a shield wall!" Thorstein's voice carried, above the chaos, strained with desperation rather than confidence. The responding warriors sounded scattered, disorganized, many likely still clouded by celebratory mead. Hakon paused at the village boundary, assessing the battle through sound, alone. The Danish force had split into 3 distinct units. 1. Engaging Ravnholm's hastily assembled defenders near the Great Hall. Another systematically burning outlying buildings. And a third circling behind to cut off escape routes to the forest. Classic Gorm tactics, executed with precision. A familiar voice cut through the din, Jarl Sigurd himself, bellowing orders that grew increasingly desperate as his forces failed to coalesce into effective resistance. The man who had sanctioned Hakon's exclusion was now paying the price for discarding his most experienced tactician. "Fall back to the hall, protect the women and children." The command indicated how quickly the situation had deteriorated. Ravnholm's warriors were being pushed inward, their defensive perimeter collapsing. Hakon stood motionless, conflict raging within him. These people had cast him aside, treated his blindness as worthlessness, relegated him to the margins of their society. By the harsh code of their culture, he owed them nothing. Yet these were still his people. The community he had defended for decades before darkness claimed his sight. More importantly, he understood what the others did not. This wasn't just another raid to be weathered. Gorm, the shrewd, never committed. His forces without absolute certainty of victory. Without intervention, Ravnholm would fall before dawn, its people enslaved or slaughtered. The decision crystallized as Hakon detected a sound that sent ice through his veins, the high-pitched whistling of fire arrows being nocked. Gorm's archers were preparing to ignite the great hall itself, where Ravnholm's women and children were now gathered. 7 years, Hakon muttered. 7 years they've looked through me like I'm already in my grave. He adjusted his grip on his staff, feeling the wolf's head carving beneath his fingers. But a blind wolf still has teeth. With surprising speed, Hakon moved toward the sounds of battle, avoiding the main conflict. His years of isolation had not been spent in self-pity, but in relentless adaptation. Though blind, he had continued to train daily, refining fighting, techniques that relied on hearing and touch rather than sight. His staff, seemingly a blind man's aid, was in truth a carefully balanced weapon, its weight and balance perfectly suited to his modified fighting style. As he approached the Danish archers preparing to fire upon the great hall, Hakon began to whistle a low, eerie tune, the same melody he had used to signal flanking maneuvers in countless battles before his blinding. The sound carried across the night air, distinctive amid the chaos of battle. The effect was immediate. Several veteran Ravnholm warriors, recognizing their former commander's signal, instinctively responded, breaking from their defensive positions to follow the sound. Muscle memory from years of training under Hakon's command kicked in, overriding their surprise at his intervention. "The blind one comes to die with us," someone shouted, but there was no mockery in the voice, only grim acknowledgement. Hakon's response was cold as winter. "I come to ensure the Danes die first." Beneath the howling gale and crash of combat, Hakon detected the subtle shifting of feet on wet grass, the whisper of bowstrings being drawn, the controlled breathing of archers preparing to release their deadly volley. These were sounds invisible to sighted warriors focused on the enemies before them, but to Hakon they painted a clear picture of the imminent threat. "They expect us to form a single wall," he explained to Thorstein, whose breathing betrayed lingering doubt despite his willingness to listen. "Instead, we create 3 smaller formations, here, here, and here." Hakon traced positions in the dirt with his staff, his spatial awareness undiminished by blindness. "The gaps between will appear as weaknesses, drawing their forces inward where we can surround them." "How can you be certain they'll take the bait?" Thorstein questioned. Hakon's scarred face turned toward the sounds of battle. "Because I know. Gorm, 20 years I've studied how he thinks, how he moves his forces. He's brilliant, but predictable in his aggression. He sees a gap, he exploits it. But tonight, those gaps will be traps." As dawn's first pale light began to illuminate the carnage, Hakon's predictions proved eerily accurate. The Danish forces, seeking to press their advantage, repeatedly charged into the deliberate openings in Ravnholm's defense, only to find themselves encircled and cut down by warriors who now moved with synchronized purpose under Hakon's direction. What seemed like chaos to others formed clear patterns to Hakon's heightened senses. Each clash of weapons, each shouted command, each shift in formation painted a tactical landscape as vivid as any he had seen with his eyes. The battlefield was a symphony of sound, and Hakon conducted his forces with the precision of a skald, directing a complex melody. "They're faltering," he announced, head tilted to catch the subtle changes in the rhythm of combat. "Their left flank breaks formation. Hear how their shields no longer strike together? Their discipline cracks." Jarl Sigurd, who had found himself fighting alongside the blind warrior he had once marginalized, responded with newfound respect. "What would you have us do?" "Press there," Hakon indicated with his staff. "Drive between their forces while they're disorganized, but hold the eastern approach. They're feigning weakness there to draw us out." The village warriors, who hours before had been celebrating their premature victory, now moved with renewed purpose. Years of dismissing the blind man's existence were forgotten as they responded to his commands, recognizing the tactical genius that blindness had somehow sharpened rather than diminished. The Danish line fractured precisely where Hakon had predicted, creating an opportunity that Ravnholm's warriors exploited with devastating efficiency. For the first time since the surprise attack began, the momentum shifted decisively, the invaders forced into a defensive retreat rather than an inexorable advance. As the morning sun broke fully over the fjord, Gorm the Shrewd made his first tactical error. Frustrated by the unexpected resistance, he committed his reserve forces too early, sending them charging toward what appeared to be a weakening point in Ravnholm's defense, exactly where Hakon had positioned their strongest. Shield-bearers in anticipation of this very move, the trap closed with brutal efficiency. Danish warriors, expecting to break through weakened opposition, instead crashed against an immovable wall of interlocked shields while flanking attackers cut into their exposed sides. The discipline that had characterized their attack dissolved into desperate individual combat. Through it all, Hakon remained eerily calm, a still point amid the storm of battle. He didn't need eyes to know the tide had turned. The sounds told him everything. The changed cadence of Danish commands, now urgent and defensive rather than confidently aggressive, the altered rhythm of their formations as they shifted from attack to survival. "They break," he announced, satisfaction evident beneath his controlled tone. "Gorm will signal retreat soon. Listen for the horn." The distinctive blast of the Danish war horn came moments later, confirming Hakon's prediction with uncanny accuracy. The invaders began a fighting withdrawal toward their remaining ships, their once orderly ranks now ragged and disorganized. Thorstein's voice carried surprise mingled with awe. "How did you know?" "I know Gorm," Hakon replied simply. "He never risks total destruction of his forces. Better a retreat to fight another day than annihilation. But he's not finished. This withdrawal is tactical, not final." As the Danish forces fell back toward the shore, Ravnholm's warriors raised a victory cry, eager to pursue their retreating enemies. But Hakon's command cut through their celebration. "Hold! Do not pursue beyond the village boundary." Jarl Sigurd, blood streaming from a shallow cut across his forehead, questioned the order. "They're vulnerable. We should finish them." Hakon shook his head, his blind gaze seeming to penetrate the fog of battle. "They want us to pursue. They have archers positioned on the eastern ridgeline. I can hear them shifting position, adjusting their aim to cover the retreat. Follow, and we'll be cut down in open ground." The Jarl hesitated, torn between the desire to complete their victory and the undeniable accuracy of Hakon's previous predictions. "You're certain?" "As certain as I am blind," Hakon replied, his voice carrying a cold edge. "The same certainty I had 7 years ago when I warned against landing at Njardarhöfen at night, the same certainty you ignored then, to our destruction." The reference to their disastrous expedition, the one that had cost Hakon his sight and dozens of warriors their lives, struck Sigurd like a physical blow. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of long unacknowledged guilt. "Stand fast," he commanded the eager warriors. "Hold your positions as Hakon says." The wisdom of this restraint became immediately apparent as Danish archers revealed their positions, loosing volleys of arrows that fell harmlessly in front of Ravnholm's defensive line, rather than cutting down pursuing warriors as intended. Gorm's carefully planned trap yielded nothing but empty ground and wasted arrows. As the Danish forces completed their withdrawal, a strange stillness settled over the battlefield. The defenders of Ravnholm, many still trying to comprehend how they had survived what should have been their annihilation, looked toward the blind warrior with new eyes. The man they had marginalized, mocked behind his back, and relegated to the periphery of their society, had just orchestrated their salvation. Jarl. Sigurd approached Hakon, his footsteps heavy with the weight of unspoken words accumulated over 7 years. The normal bustle of post-battle activity, tending the wounded, securing prisoners, assessing damage, continued around them. But a bubble of quiet seemed to envelop the two men. "You saved us all," Sigurd finally acknowledged, his voice rough, with emotion that the stoic culture of their people rarely permitted. "When you had every reason to let us fall." Hakon remained silent, his scarred face impassive. The victory had not erased 7 years of isolation, of being treated as less than a man because his eyes no longer functioned. His hands still gripped his staff with warrior's strength, though the battle had subsided. "You knew," Sigurd continued, filling the silence. "You knew it was a feint, that the real attack would come during our celebration, just as you knew about the archers on the ridge just now." "I listened," Hakon replied simply. "When a man loses his eyes, his ears must serve for both." The Jarl's next words came with difficulty, pride battling with the need for truth. 7 years ago, at Njardarhöfen, you warned me about landing at night. Said there could be ambushes. We couldn't see in the darkness. I remember." Hakon's voice was devoid of accusation, but carried the weight of consequence. 28 warriors never returned, and I came back less than I was. No, Sigurd's response came with sudden clarity. We were wrong about that. You came back more, not less. We were too blind ourselves to see it. For the first time, Hakon's composure cracked slightly, his jaw tightening at words he had never expected to hear from the proud Jarl. Before he could respond, however, a commotion arose from the shore. Scouts returned with urgent news that the surviving Danish ships had not sailed for open water, but were instead regrouping further along the coast. "They're not leaving," the young scout reported, his voice carrying the alarm of one who had just witnessed something unexpected and threatening. "They're gathering more ships from around the headland, dozens of them. Gorm brought his entire fleet." Jarl Sigurd turned to Hakon, newfound respect evident in his tone. "You said this withdrawal was tactical, not final." Hakon nodded grimly. "Gorm never commits to a single strategy. He always prepares alternatives. This morning was merely his first attempt. He'll come again, with greater numbers and a different approach." "How long do we have?" Hakon tilted his head, as if listening to things beyond normal hearing. "The wind shifts. They'll wait for favorable conditions before attempting another landing, perhaps until nightfall." "Then we have the day to prepare," Sigurd announced, addressing the gathered warriors, "and this time we'll be ready for them." He turned back to Hakon, his next words carrying formal weight in front of the entire village. "Hakon Ragnarsson, I ask you to take command of Ravnholm's defense. Guide our preparations as you guided our battle this morning." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors and villagers. To ask a blind man to command their forces went against everything their culture valued: physical prowess, keen eyesight, visible strength. Yet none could deny what they had just witnessed, how Hakon's blindness had somehow made him more perceptive, not less, to the patterns of battle. Hakon stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing upon him. 7 years of isolation and dismissal couldn't be erased by a single request, no matter how sincere. The temptation to refuse, to let these people face the consequences of their previous rejection, flared briefly in his chest. But deeper than his wounded pride lay the core of who he had always been, a protector of his people, a strategic mind, who saw patterns others missed, a warrior who fought not for glory, but for the survival of his community. That essence remained undiminished by blindness or isolation. "I will guide your defense," he finally replied, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Not for you, Sigurd, nor for the council that declared me worthless. I do this for Ravnholm itself, for the children who bear no responsibility for how their elders treated a blind man." Relief washed visibly across Sigurd's face. "That is more than we deserve, but exactly what we need." Hakon wasted no time on further words. "Bring me your ship captains, your most experienced warriors, and anyone who knows the coastline intimately. Meet at the Great Hall when the sun reaches mid-morning position." As the crowd dispersed to carry out his instructions, Hakon remained momentarily alone, the sounds of the wounded being tended and damage being assessed washing over him in waves of information. His blindness, once seen as his greatest weakness, had transformed into his most powerful weapon. Where others saw only what was directly before them, Hakon perceived patterns, connections, and possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate. The isolation forced upon him had become his strength. Cut off from normal social interaction, he had developed his other senses to extraordinary levels. Denied the respect of his peers, he had focused inward, refining his tactical mind without the distractions of status or approval-seeking. The very suffering intended to diminish him had instead forged him into something more formidable than he had been before. Thorstein approached. His footsteps recognizable among hundreds, Hakon could now identify by sound alone. The warrior who had earlier dismissed his tactical insights now spoke with humbled respect. "The men will follow your commands without question after what they witnessed today." But Gorm is cunning, and he still outnumbers us significantly. Do we truly have a chance against his full force? Hakon turned his face toward the fjord, where the sounds of Danish ships regrouping carried across the water. Numbers and sight are advantages, yes, but they're not the only factors in battle. What advantages do we have? A rare smile crossed Hakon's scarred face. We have what they don't expect, a commander who sees with more than eyes. And we have something Gorm cannot anticipate. What's that? Knowledge born of darkness, Hakon replied, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. Things I've learned during 7 years of being invisible to my own people. As they walked toward the great hall, Hakon began outlining elements of his defensive strategy, approaches to the village that only a man who navigated by sound and touch would have discovered, patterns in the tides and winds that affected how ships could approach the harbor, weaknesses in traditional Viking combat formations that became apparent when one could hear, rather than see, the flow of battle. Thorstein listened with growing amazement, gradually understanding that Hakon's blindness had not diminished his warrior spirit, but had instead transformed it into something new, a tactical mind unhindered by the limitations of visual perception, able to process patterns of sound, smell, and movement that sighted warriors overlooked. By the time they reached the Great Hall, Ravnholm's ship captains and veteran warriors had already gathered, an unusual solemnity replacing their customary boastful demeanor. They had witnessed something that challenged the core of their warrior culture, a blind man outmaneuvering a sighted enemy through superior perception, not despite his blindness, but because of how it had transformed his understanding of battle. Hakon entered the hall with confident steps, navigating the familiar space without hesitation. He had spent decades in this room before his blinding, participating in countless war councils and celebrations. Now he returned not as a pitied outsider, but as their best hope for survival. Gorm brings his full strength against us, he began without preamble, his voice carrying the authority that had once made him Ravnholm's most respected military leader. By nightfall, they will attempt another landing, likely from multiple approaches. Simultaneously, how can we defend against an attack from multiple directions? One of the older ship captains questioned. We lack the numbers to cover every possible landing point. We don't need to cover every approach, Hakon replied, his scarred face animated with strategic certainty. Only to make Gorm believe we can. Over the next hour, he outlined a defensive strategy unlike anything the warriors of Ravnholm had previously considered. Instead of relying solely on shield walls and direct combat, Hakon's plan incorporated elements that sighted warriors typically overlooked: how sound traveled across water at night, how different winds affected the accuracy of archers, how the positioning of seemingly abandoned structures could channel attackers into vulnerable positions. Most surprising was his detailed knowledge of underwater features along the coastline, rocks, sandbars, and currents that could be used to guide enemy ships into natural hazards. This information came not from visual mapping, but from years of listening to how waves broke differently over submerged obstacles, how the wind caught differently in protected coves versus exposed headlands. During my years of exile, Hakon explained, addressing the unspoken question of how a blind man could know these details, I walked every inch of our coastline, learning it anew through sound and touch. What my eyes once showed me, my ears now reveal with greater precision. The gathered warriors exchanged glances of mingled respect and disbelief. Their culture had always valued physical prowess above all, equating blindness with helplessness. Yet here stood living proof that perception extended beyond sight, that darkness itself could become a source of knowledge impossible for the sighted to access. As the council continued, Hakon assigned specific tasks to each group of defenders, positioning them according to strengths that sometimes surprised their own commanders. He placed archers where subtle wind patterns would favor their aim, while hindering enemy arrows. He situated shield walls where terrain features would naturally channel attackers into vulnerable formations. Most importantly, he incorporated elements of deception, false targets, sound misdirection, and strategic gaps designed to lure Danish forces into prepared traps. The complexity of the plan revealed a mind that had been refining tactical thinking during 7 years of forced isolation, analyzing battles from perspectives unavailable to those who relied primarily on sight. Remember, Hakon concluded, as the council prepared to implement his instructions. Gorm expects to fight warriors who think as he does, who rely on what their eyes tell them. Her advantage lies in perceiving what remains invisible to him. As the warriors dispersed to begin preparations, Jarl Sigurd remained behind, his presence marked by the distinctive sound of his breathing, slightly labored from the mornings. Combat but controlled as befitted a leader. "For 7 years," he said quietly when they were alone, "I've led these people believing strength comes only from what we can see and touch. You've shown us there are other forms of power." Hakon turned, his scarred face toward the Jarl, decades of shared history hanging between them. "Blindness didn't give me wisdom, Sigurd. Isolation did. When a man is cut off from his community, he either breaks or finds new ways to understand the world." "And you?" "I broke first," Hakon admitted, his voice carrying the memory of those dark, early days after losing his sight. "Shattered like poorly forged iron, but then I began to rebuild myself, forging something stronger from the fragments." Outside the hall, Ravnfjord transformed into a hive of purposeful activity, warriors and villagers alike implementing Hakon's defensive strategy with an urgency born of their morning's near defeat. The blind commander had accomplished something remarkable. He had given them not just tactics, but renewed confidence, a belief that they could stand against Gorm's superior numbers. As Hakon stepped from the great hall, his acute hearing captured dozens of conversations, preparations, and movements throughout the village. What would have been chaos to others formed clear patterns to his enhanced perception. For the first time since losing his sight, he felt fully alive again, his mind engaged with the complex challenge of battle, his knowledge valued rather than dismissed. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Hakon stood on the same cliff edge where he had first detected the morning's attack. His heightened senses extended across the fjord, where Danish ships gathered like wolves, preparing for a night hunt. They would come with the darkness, believing it gave them advantage. They couldn't know that darkness had been Hakon's teacher for 7 years, a harsh master who had stripped away his reliance on sight and forced him to develop perceptions that went beyond what eyes could reveal. The waiting game had begun. But this time, Ravnfjord would not be caught unprepared. This time they had a commander whose greatest weakness had become his and their greatest strength. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting Ravnfjord's wounded landscape in hues of amber and gold. Throughout the village, warriors and civilians alike worked with grim determination to implement Hakon's defensive strategy. Barricades rose at carefully selected positions, not blocking approaches entirely, but channeling them into deadly funnels. Archers positioned themselves where Hakon had indicated subtle wind advantages would favor their aim. Shield-bearers rehearsed the unconventional formations he had designed to exploit the predictable patterns of Danish attacks. From his position near the Great Hall, Hakon absorbed the symphony of preparation through his heightened senses. Each hammer strike, each shouted instruction, each scrape of blade against whetstone told him precisely how the defenses were progressing. His mental map of Ravnfjord, constructed through 7 years of navigating by sound and touch, enabled him to track dozens of simultaneous activities with uncanny precision. "Your plan challenges everything we've been taught about warfare," observed Freya, the village's master healer, as she prepared bandages beside him. Though not a warrior herself, she had treated enough battle wounds to understand conventional tactics. No single shield wall, no concentrated defensive position. Conventional tactics rely on what warriors can see, Hakon replied, his scarred face angled toward the fjord where Danish ships gathered. I've learned there are patterns beneath what eyes perceive. Like what? Her voice carried genuine curiosity rather than the skepticism he had grown accustomed to. Listen to the waves breaking against the northern shore, he instructed. Hear how they strike in groups of 3, then a longer pause. That reveals underwater. Rock formations invisible from the surface. Ships approaching there will struggle with unpredictable currents. Freya fell silent, listening as he suggested. Her breath caught as she began to discern the pattern. I've lived beside this fjord my entire life and never noticed. Few do. Eyes distract from deeper perceptions. Hakon's tone carried no bitterness, merely statement of fact. Gorm expects to fight warriors who perceive as he does. That expectation becomes his vulnerability. A messenger approached. Footsteps, hurried but controlled. The scouts report Danish ships beginning to move, forming into 3 separate attack groups. Hakon nodded, unsurprised. They'll approach from multiple directions, believing we lack numbers to defend everywhere simultaneously. He rose with fluid grace, staff in hand. Summon the War Council. It's time for final preparations. The Great. Hall filled quickly with Ravnholm's defenders, their demeanor transformed since morning. Where once skepticism had greeted Hakon's insights, now attentive silence fell as he outlined the coming battle. Gorm divides his forces, thinking to overwhelm us through numerical advantage at multiple points, Hakon explained, tracing positions in the air with his staff. But division creates vulnerability if properly exploited. We still face 3-to-1 odds, noted Gunnar, one of the older warriors. Even divided, each of their attack groups outnumbers our entire force. Numbers matter less than perception. Hakon countered. Gorm sees our defense conventionally, warriors positioned to protect territory. Instead, we'll become like water, flowing between positions, appearing stronger where we choose to concentrate, then disappearing when they commit forces. He detailed how specific groups would engage, then disengage, creating an illusion of greater numbers through constant movement. Other teams would manipulate sound, metal against shields, war cries from unexpected directions, to confuse Danish perceptions of Ravnholm's defensive positions. Most importantly, Hakon concluded, we fight on our terms, not theirs. They expect us to defend fixed positions. Instead, we'll draw them into terrain that negates their numerical advantage. As warriors dispersed to final positions, Jarl Sigurd remained behind. This strategy, he said quietly, it's unlike anything in our traditions. So is a blind commander, Hakon replied with grim humor. Yet both may save Ravnholm tonight. The Jarl's voice carried a weight of realization. For years we've raided, lived by what we could see and touch. You've shown there are other ways to perceive the world. Before Hakon could respond, horn blasts from the shoreline announced the first Danish ships had begun their approach. The conversation ended as both men moved to their positions, Sigurd to lead the central defense, Hakon to the elevated position. He'd chosen near the village center, where sound would bring him clearest understanding of the battle's flow. Dusk settled over Ravnholm as the first Danish warriors made landfall, their war cries echoing across the fjord. Unlike the morning's surprise attack, this assault came with full force, hundreds of warriors disembarking simultaneously from multiple beaches, advancing with the discipline that had made Gorm's forces feared throughout the northern lands. From his position, Hakon tracked their movements through sound alone, the rhythm of marching feet, the pattern of shouted commands, the distinctive scrape of shields readied for combat. Each auditory detail painted a tactical picture as clear as any he'd seen with functioning eyes. They concentrate heaviest on the northern approach, he informed Thorstein, who served as his messenger. Send word to Sigurd. Draw them deeper before engaging. Let them believe our defense there is weakening. Throughout the village, Ravnholm's defenders implemented Hakon's unconventional strategy with growing confidence. Instead of meeting the Danish forces in traditional shield-wall confrontations, they engaged briefly, then withdrew, creating an illusion of retreat that drew attackers deeper into prepared killing zones. Meanwhile, other defenders executed Hakon's sound deception tactics, striking shields in one location while attacking from another, creating an impression of greater numbers through carefully orchestrated noise. The resulting confusion disrupted the Danish advance, breaking their carefully planned formations as unit leaders received conflicting information about Ravnholm's defensive positions. Through it all, Hakon remained eerily calm, processing the battles flow through sound and occasional tactile information brought by messengers. While others saw only fragments of the conflict from their immediate positions, his mind assembled a comprehensive tactical overview from hundreds of auditory inputs. Gorm commits his reserve forces to the northern approach, he announced, head tilted to catch subtle changes in the battle sounds. They believe they've found our weakness. Should we reinforce there? Thorstein asked, prepared to relay new orders. No. This is what we prepared for. A rare smile crossed Hakon's scarred face. Send word to Gunnar. Spring the northern trap now. The trap was Hakon's masterstroke, a concealed ravine that appeared as solid ground in the gathering darkness, covered with brush and appearing as a natural path into the village. As Danish reinforcements charged forward, believing they were exploiting a defensive gap, the ground gave way beneath them. Dozens of warriors tumbled into the hidden ditch, their formation shattered, vulnerable to arrows from concealed archers on both sides. The resulting chaos rippled through the Danish forces. What had appeared as an imminent breakthrough transformed instantly into a devastating setback. Confusion spread as commanders struggled to understand what had happened, their carefully planned assault unraveling against defenses that seemed to anticipate their every move. Gorm's distinctive war horn sounded, attempting to rally his fragmented forces. But the damage was done. The coordinated three-pronged attack had devolved into disconnected skirmishes as Danish warriors found themselves repeatedly drawn into prepared ambush positions. They begin to doubt, Hakon observed, his acute hearing, catching the changed cadence of Danish commands, now defensive rather than confidently aggressive. Doubt leads to hesitation, hesitation to vulnerability. Throughout the village, Ravnholm's defenders pressed their advantage, implementing Hakon's fluid defensive strategy with increasing skill. Warriors, who had spent lifetimes training in conventional shield formations, adapted to his unconventional approach, appearing, striking, disappearing, then reappearing where least expected. The Danish forces, accustomed to enemies who fought predictably to defend territory, found themselves unable to establish solid footing against defenders who moved like shadows through their own terrain. Every advance met resistance from unexpected directions. Every attempted consolidation drew deadly arrow fire from concealed positions. By midnight, the momentum had shifted decisively. What had begun as an overwhelming assault by superior forces had transformed into fragmented pockets of increasingly desperate Danish warriors trying to maintain cohesion against an enemy that seemed to materialize from darkness itself. Gorm will attempt one final concentrated push, Hakon predicted, his head tilted to track the reorganization of Danish forces through sound alone. He gathers his remaining elite warriors near the eastern landing. How can you possibly know? That? Asked a young messenger, voicing the amazement many still felt at Hakon's perceptions. Listen to the difference in their shield sounds, Hakon explained patiently. Elite warriors carry heavier shields, reinforced with iron bands. The sound against their leather armor is distinctive, deeper, more resonant. The messenger fell, silent, straining to hear such subtle distinctions amid the chaos of battle. But Hakon's prediction proved unerringly accurate, as Gorm personally led his household guards in a desperate charge toward Ravnholm's eastern approach, attempting to establish a secure beachhead from which to reorganize his scattered forces. Now, we meet strength with strength, Hakon decided, recognizing the critical moment had arrived. Send word to Sigurd, commit our main force to the eastern defense. This is where the battle will be decided. For the first time that night, Ravnholm's defenders abandoned the fluid tactics that had confounded the Danish attackers, instead forming a solid shield wall across the eastern approach. Jarl Sigurd himself took center position, the village's most experienced warriors locked shoulder to shoulder beside him. The clash, when Gorm's elite forces met this concentrated defense, resounded across the fjord. Steel against steel, shield against shield, the ground itself seeming to tremble beneath the concussive force of bodies in desperate combat. Here was the traditional warfare both sides understood, the direct confrontation of strength against strength that had decided Viking conflicts for generations. But even in this conventional engagement, Hakon's influence proved decisive. The shield wall he had designed incorporated subtle innovations, slight angles that deflected the force of impact, specific overlapping patterns that distributed weight more effectively, positioning that utilized the natural slope of ground to enhance defensive stability. These refinements, born from Hakon's years of analyzing combat through non-visual means, created a defensive formation unlike any Gorm had previously encountered. His elite warriors, expecting to break through with superior numbers and individual skill, instead found themselves facing a living fortress that absorbed their assault without fracturing. The fighting grew desperate as Danish warriors, understanding their advantage slipping away, threw themselves against Ravnholm's shield wall with berserker fury. Blood slickened the ground, the wounded and dying creating treacherous footing for both attackers and defenders. Throughout this crucial engagement, Hakon remained at his elevated position, tracking the battle through its sounds and the tactile information brought by messengers. Where others saw only the immediate clash before them, his mind processed the entire tactical situation, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities that visual fighters overlooked. They commit everything to breaking our wall, he noted, hearing the growing desperation in Danish war cries. Their flanks weaken as they concentrate force. Should we counterattack? Thorstein asked, prepared to relay new orders. Not yet. Let them exhaust themselves first. Hakon's patience, always his tactical signature even before blindness, had only deepened during his years of isolation. When Gorm commits his personal guard, that's our moment. The prediction materialized minutes later as Gorm the Shrewd, recognizing his assault faltering, committed his personal household guards, his most elite warriors, held in reserve until absolute necessity demanded their use. Their distinctive war cry echoed across the battlefield as they charged forward, massive warriors wielding Dane axes capable of splintering shields with single blows. Now, Hakon commanded, hearing the change in combat rhythm. Send word to gunners. Archers, target the Danish right flank, and tell Sigurd to prepare for the hammer stroke on my signal. The hammer stroke was Hakon's term for the counterattack he had designed specifically for this moment, when the enemy committed fully to a frontal assault, leaving their flanks vulnerable. As Danish household guards concentrated their awesome strength against Ravnholm's center, concealed archers emerged on their right flank, loosing devastating volleys into unprotected sides. Simultaneously, a reserve force Hakon had positioned specifically for this purpose swung around to strike the Danish left, creating a classic hammer and anvil maneuver that caught Gorm's elite warriors in a deadly crossfire. The effect was devastating. What had been a concentrated assault suddenly became a desperate fight for survival, as Danish warriors found themselves attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. Their formation, optimized for forward momentum, couldn't adapt quickly enough to threats from multiple angles. From the center of the shield wall, Jarl Sigurd recognized the critical moment as Danish cohesion fractured. "Forward!" he bellowed, signaling the advance Hakon had prepared them for. "Push them back to the sea!" Ravnfjord's shield wall, which had absorbed tremendous punishment without breaking, now surged forward with coordinated power. Warriors who had stood defensive for hours channeled their pent-up energy into overwhelming offensive force, driving into Danish ranks with unstoppable momentum. The combined pressure, archers from one flank, fresh warriors from the other, and the main shield wall driving forward, proved too much for even Gorm's legendary discipline to withstand. The Danish formation collapsed into individual fighters, struggling for survival rather than victory. Amidst this chaos, a single combat unfolded that would be remembered in sagas for generations. Gorm the Shrewd, recognizing his assault failing, fought through the press of bodies to confront Jarl Sigurd directly. Their clash, Jarl against Jarl, leader against leader, momentarily became the battle's focus as warriors from both sides paused to witness this decisive encounter. Gorm's renowned skill made him a fearsome opponent, his sword moving with blinding speed despite the night's exhausting combat. Sigurd, though fighting with courage born of defending his home, found himself driven backward by the Danish Jarl's ferocious assault. A messenger breathlessly reported this development to Hakon, whose blind face revealed no emotion as he processed this critical information. "Sigurd cannot defeat Gorm alone," he stated with certainty, born of decades fighting alongside both men. "Their skills were evenly matched when I could still see, and Gorm has only improved since." "What can we do?" the messenger asked, urgency evident. "If Sigurd falls, take me to them," Hakon interrupted, rising with sudden decisiveness. Quickly, the request shocked those nearby. A blind man entering active combat seemed like suicide, especially with the battle still hanging in the balance. Yet something in Hakon's tone brooked no argument. The messenger guided him toward the central clash, where Gorm and Sigurd continued their desperate duel. Hakon moved with surprising confidence, his staff navigating obstacles with practiced precision. The sounds of battle provided orientation, more accurate than sight might have, each clash and cry painting spatial relationships his brain interpreted instantaneously. He reached the clearing where the Jarls fought, just as Sigurd stumbled, momentarily losing balance on blood-slickened ground. Gorm, seizing advantage, raised his sword for a killing stroke, only to have it intercepted by Hakon's staff, thrust forward with uncanny accuracy. "Hakon Ragnarsson," Gorm's voice carried surprise mingled with derision. "They said you were blinded. And Njardarhofen, I see they spoke truth. You've come to die alongside your Jarl." "I've come to demonstrate why you're losing this battle," Hakon replied, his voice carrying a calm certainty that gave even the Danish warlord pause. "You fight with eyes alone, while we've learned to perceive with all senses." With that cryptic statement, Hakon shifted into a fighting stance, unlike any conventional Viking combat position. His staff, previously appearing as a blind man's aid, revealed its true nature as a carefully balanced weapon, designed specifically for his transformed fighting style. Gorm's laugh held genuine amusement. "A blind man challenges Gorm the Shrewd? The Skalds will remember this jest for generations." He lunged forward, his sword sweeping in a devastating arc toward Hakon's unprotected side. Yet the blind warrior moved with impossible precision, not just evading the strike, but countering with a staff blow that caught Gorm unprepared, staggering him backward. The Danish Jarl's expression transformed from amusement to confusion, then growing concern as subsequent attacks met similar results. What witnesses observed defied conventional understanding of combat. Hakon, unable to see his opponent, nevertheless anticipated each move before it fully developed. His staff intercepted sword strikes that should have been invisible to him. His positioning shifted to counter footwork he couldn't possibly observe. Gorm, increasingly desperate, abandoned technique for raw aggression, launching a flurry of attacks. From rapidly changing angles. "How can you see my blade?" he demanded, frustration evident as Hakon continued to evade and counter with unnatural precision. "I don't see your blade," Hakon replied, his scarred face revealing nothing. "I hear your intent before your muscles respond. Your breathing changes, your weight shifts, your armor creaks differently before each type of strike." The revelation stunned those close enough to hear. What appeared supernatural was instead the culmination of 7 years Hakon had spent developing perceptions beyond sight, learning to read combat through sounds and air movements that sighted. Warriors filtered out as background noise. Gorm, realization dawning that he faced something beyond his experience, attempted one final desperate assault, a complex combination of strikes designed to overwhelm any defense. But Hakon, perceiving the subtle preparations through sound alone, was already moving to counter. His staff struck with precision that seemed impossible for a blind man, catching Gorm's sword arm at the exact moment of extension, before momentum could develop into full force. The Danish Jarl's weapon clattered to the ground, and in the next instant, Hakon's staff rested against his throat. An impossible silence fell across the battlefield as warriors from both sides witnessed something none had believed possible: a blind man besting the legendary Gorm in direct combat. The Danish Jarl himself seemed most stunned of all, his worldview shattered by defeat at hands that couldn't see what they struck. "Yield," Hakon stated simply, his staff maintaining unwavering pressure against Gorm's throat. "Your attack has failed. Further resistance brings only more death." For a long moment the outcome hung in balance. Gorm's pride warred visibly with his tactical assessment of the situation. Finally, pragmatism prevailed. "I yield," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent battlefield. "Ravnholm has won this night, though by means I scarcely comprehend." The Danish surrender rippled outward as commanders relayed Gorm's decision to their warriors. Weapons lowered, the desperate clash of moments before transforming into stunned aftermath. Ravnholm's defenders, equally shocked by the battle's sudden conclusion, maintained wary readiness until certain the surrender was genuine. Jarl Sigurd, regaining his feet after Hakon's intervention had saved his life, approached the blind warrior with newfound humility. "Twice in one day you've saved our village," he acknowledged publicly. "First through your strategy, now through your sword arm, or staff arm, it seems." "I merely applied what darkness taught me," Hakon replied, his voice carrying no triumph. "Merely statement of fact. When eyes fail, other senses compensate, revealing patterns invisible to sight alone." Gorm, still processing his defeat, studied Hakon with growing comprehension. 7 years ago at Njardarhøfen, you were already Ravnholm's finest tactician. I planned that ambush specifically to remove you from their defense." A rueful smile crossed his face. "It seems I created a more formidable opponent instead." "Blindness didn't make me stronger," Hakon corrected him. "Being cast aside did. Isolation forced me to develop perceptions others never need. Necessity became advantage." The profound truth in this simple statement resonated beyond immediate battle implications. warriors from both sides recognized something. Transformative had occurred, not just a military victory, but a fundamental challenge to how they perceived strength, weakness, and the nature of perception itself. As dawn's first light broke over Ravnholm's bloodied landscape, it illuminated a village saved from destruction through means none could have predicted, by a blind commander whose greatest weakness had become their salvation. The cost had been high. Dozens of defenders lay dead or wounded, buildings smoldered from fire arrows, and the physical damage would take months to repair. Yet something more significant had been reconstructed overnight. The village's understanding of value and contribution, of how different forms of perception might complement rather than replace one another. Hakon stood at the cliff edge where he had first detected the Danish approach, his acute hearing tracking the departing ships as Gorm's surviving forces withdrew according to negotiated terms. Beside him, Jarl Sigurd seemed to search for adequate words to address 7 years of misunderstanding. "We were wrong," he finally said simply. "Not just about this battle, but about you, about what blindness means. You saw only what was taken from me," Hakon replied without bitterness, "not what was given in its place." And now? The question hung between them, laden with implications beyond immediate victory celebration. Would Hakon return to isolation on the village periphery? Would temporary respect earned through crisis fade once immediate danger passed? Before Hakon could respond, approaching footsteps announced a gathering of villagers, not just warriors, but craftspeople, fishermen, children, elders, the entire community he had been separated from for 7 years. "The council has met," announced Gunnar, the eldest village leader, his voice carrying formal weight. "Ravnholm owes you more than can be repaid, Hakon Ragnarsson, but we begin by acknowledging our error in casting you aside." The old man's voice faltered momentarily before continuing with greater strength. "We saw blindness as weakness because we ourselves were blind to different forms of strength. Tonight you've taught us that darkness holds its own wisdom, that different ways of perceiving the world bring insights impossible through sight alone." A murmur of agreement passed through the gathered villagers, many of whom had previously avoided direct interaction with the blind warrior they'd considered useless. Now they viewed him through transformed understanding, not as diminished, but as possessing perceptions beyond their own experience. "We ask you to return," Gunnar continued, "not to isolation, but to your rightful place among us, as council member, as battle leader, as teacher who might help us perceive what our eyes alone cannot show us." Hakon remained still, his scarred face revealing nothing as he absorbed this unexpected offer. 7 years of rejection couldn't be erased by a single victory, no matter how decisive. The wound of exclusion had cut deeper than any battle injury, yet beneath that pain lay the truth of who he had always been, a protector, a leader, a man who found meaning in contributing to his community's welfare. Darkness had transformed how he perceived the world, but it hadn't changed that essential core. "I will return," he finally replied, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Not because you now recognize my worth, but because Ravnholm remains my home, its people my responsibility, as they always were, even when viewed from the shadows." The sun climbed higher over the fjord, illuminating a village forever changed by night's revelations. The battle was won, but a more significant victory had been achieved in understanding that supposed weakness might contain unexpected strength, that darkness could reveal what light obscured, that different forms of perception might complement, rather than replace one another. As the villagers dispersed to begin rebuilding, Hakon felt a small hand slip into his. A child's voice, filled with innocent curiosity rather than the fear or pity he'd grown accustomed to, asked a question that crystallized everything the night had transformed. "Hakon Storm-Eye," the child said, using a name he'd never been called. Before, will you teach us to see in the dark like you do? For the first time in 7 years, Hakon smiled without reservation. I will teach you to perceive with more than eyes, he promised, for true vision comes not from sight alone, but from understanding that every shadow contains its own form of light. The battle for Ravnholm had reached its decisive moment. Blood-soaked ground and exhausted warriors marked the night's desperate struggle, yet something profound had shifted beyond mere military advantage. As dawn's first light crept across the fjord, Gorm sat opposite Hakon in the great hall. Negotiations. For Danish withdrawal proceeding with grim formality. Terms are simple, Hakon stated, his scarred face impassive. Your forces depart our waters by midday. Ravnholm remains independent, free from tribute or obligation to your holdings. Gorm studied the blind warrior with newfound respect. You've earned that much and more. Few have ever turned back my full strength. None commanded from darkness. As you have. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. What I witnessed tonight challenges everything I believed about warfare, about sight and blindness, strength and weakness. Then you've gained wisdom alongside defeat, Hakon replied. Fair exchange. The following days brought rapid transformation to village life. As Danish ships disappeared over the horizon, Hakon began implementing his second condition immediately, gathering small groups to teach perceptions beyond sight. Children proved especially receptive, their minds unburdened by rigid assumptions about strength and weakness. Close your eyes, he instructed them during their first lesson, and tell me what you hear. Initial responses came hesitantly, obvious sounds of nearby. Activities, voices, livestock, listen deeper, Hakon encouraged. Beyond immediate noise lies another layer of perception. Gradually, the children began discovering sounds they'd never consciously registered. Subtle rhythms of waves revealing underwater formations, different tones in wind indicating approaching weather changes, distinctive cadences in footsteps, identifying specific individuals before they spoke. Adults watched these lessons with initial skepticism that gradually transformed to genuine interest. Warriors particularly noted how Hakon's techniques might enhance their effectiveness, allowing perception of opponents' movements through sound when vision was compromised by battle conditions. 1 month after the Danish attack, Ravnholm hosted neighboring settlements for their annual trading council. Visitors noticed immediate differences in how the village operated. Blind Hakon participating as chief tactical advisor without hint of accommodation or pity, village children navigating portions of meetings blindfolded to practice alternative perceptions, defensive positions arranged to maximize advantages of sound and touch as much as sight. Most significantly, they observed how Jarl Sigurd consistently turned to Hakon during discussions, valuing his insights not despite blindness, but because his different perspective revealed options others overlooked. Ravnholm has changed, remarked Eirik, Jarl of neighboring Kestivale. Your people move differently, listen differently. We've learned costly lessons, Sigurd acknowledged. Strength takes many forms, and perception extends beyond what eyes reveal. Word spread throughout the northern territories, tales of the blind Viking who had defeated Gorm the Shrewd through perceptions that transcended sight. Some dismissed these stories as exaggeration, but visiting merchants confirmed extraordinary changes in Ravnholm's approach to warfare, governance, and community. By winter solstice, 6 months after the battle, Hakon's position had evolved beyond tactical advisor. He had become Ravnholm's first perception master, a new role created specifically to institutionalize what his victory had demonstrated. Young warriors now trained blindfolded for portions of their preparation, developing senses beyond sight. Village decisions incorporated perspectives previously ignored, including those from members once marginalized by physical limitations. On midwinter night, as Ravnholm gathered for traditional celebrations, Hakon sat beside the great fire, listening to sounds that painted vivid pictures no eyes could capture. The distinctive breathing patterns of different families, the subtle shifts in conversation rhythms that revealed emerging bonds between young couples, the gentle movements of elders, whose wisdom remained sharp though bodies had weakened. Freya, the master healer, settled beside him. "You've transformed more than our defenses," she observed quietly. "You've changed how we understand strength itself." Hakon nodded, acknowledging truth in her assessment. What was intended as punishment became unexpected gift. Darkness taught me to perceive what light obscured, and now you teach us all to see differently. Her voice carried admiration tinged with something deeper, recognition of how profoundly one person's perspective could reshape an entire community's understanding. The greatest victory, Hakon reflected, wasn't against the Danes. It was against our own limited perception of capability. His scarred face turned toward the sounds of children playing nearby, some deliberately blindfolded, teaching themselves to navigate by sound and touch with enthusiasm rather than fear. They will grow understanding that limitation in one area often develops extraordinary strength in others. As the celebration continued around them, Hakon sensed Jarl Sigurd approaching, his distinctive gait recognizable among hundreds. "The council has finished the winter's first saga recording," Sigurd announced when he reached them. "They wished you to hear it before sharing publicly." Interest rippled through nearby villagers, who quieted to listen as the Jarl unrolled a parchment. "Thus begins the saga of Hakon Stormeye," Sigurd read formally, "who taught Ravnholm that true vision comes not from eyes alone, but from perceiving what others cannot see. That darkness holds wisdom light may never know, that strength flows from many sources, and that those cast aside often return bearing gifts previously unimagined." Hakon remained silent as the saga continued, detailing the battle's events with typical Norse embellishment. Yet beneath poetic flourishes lay profound truth. His victory had demonstrated that disability might create opportunities rather than simply impose limitations. When the reading concluded, Hakon rose to address the gathered village. "This saga honors me excessively," he began with characteristic modesty, "yet misses the greater lesson. My blindness revealed nothing you couldn't have discovered with eyes still functioning, had you thought to close them occasionally and truly. Listen." Gentle laughter acknowledged his point, but Hakon continued more seriously. "What happened here extends beyond one battle, beyond one blind warrior. We've begun understanding that different forms of perception enrich rather than threaten us, that strength manifests in ways we've previously failed to recognize." He gestured toward the children still practicing navigation without sight. "They learn already what took me years to understand. The darkness need not be feared, for it reveals what light conceals. That apparent weakness, properly understood, creates opportunities impossible through conventional strength alone." As his words settled across the hushed gathering, Hakon felt something profound had been accomplished beyond military victory. A fundamental shift in how an entire community understood capability and contribution, strength and perception, darkness and light. The blind Viking had not merely saved his village from destruction, he had transformed how they perceived themselves and others, creating legacy that would outlast any battlefield triumph. Warriors and shield maidens, if this saga of the blind Viking who found strength in darkness resonated in your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of extraordinary Norse heroes who overcame impossible odds. Hit that notification bell like Thor's hammer striking an anvil so you never miss our weekly Viking legends. Next week, we'll bring you the epic story of the shield maiden who infiltrated a rival clan disguised as a servant, only to become their greatest defender when mountain trolls descended upon their halls. The comment section awaits your thoughts. On Hakon's storm-eyes journey, tell us what part of his transformation most inspired you. Until our next saga, remember, true vision comes not from eyes alone, but from perceiving what others cannot see.